Welcome to another edition of Begley's Mailbag, where we answer your questions on the Knicks and the NBA. And we're going to start off with Dewey and MSG, who wonders, is it likely that the Knicks make their own first-round pick in the upcoming draft, or are they going to trade down or trade it for an established player? You know, if I was making an odds board at the moment, I would say trade it for an established player is most likely, but, you know, not by a significant margin. But I say that because you look at where the Knicks are right now. They want to improve the roster this offseason. The trade is the most likely route. And obviously the first round pick is a trade chip in any significant improvement of this roster that you're going to make via trade. So I think that's more likely. And if you look at the history of the Knicks on draft night, you know, they've made draft night trades each of the past couple of years. And so there's a history of that. But I think in a big picture sense, you're looking at the Knicks not having any cap space really to speak of going into this summer, and you're looking at them trying to improve the roster. So the trade route is the easiest route for them, and that's why I think most likely right now is they trade that pick, although, you know, plenty can happen between now and draft night. Next, we've got a question from Guard Up Knicks, who asks, is it wise to focus on the development of Jericho Sims as our center rather than re-sign Mitch for maybe more than his value is? And this is a question that the Knicks are having to consider and will have to consider as you enter the offseason, because Robinson, while he's eligible for an extension, he's most likely to hit free agency. I was told that, you know, they've talked about an extension over the course of the season, Robinson's representatives in the Knicks, and at one point before the trade deadline, they were not close at all in terms of figures of what Robinson's side was looking for and what the Knicks were looking for. So that tells me that it's most likely he's going to hit free agency. So I think you have to be prepared if you're the Knicks to lose him. And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing Jericho Sims have regular minutes here, right? We're not seeing any other young player, untested player get regular rotation time, but we're seeing with Jericho Sims. I think part of the reason is because the Knicks need to know what they have in Sims going into an offseason where they may lose Mitchell Robinson. Now, is it wise to do that? I don't know. I think it depends on the offers that come Robinson's way. He's obviously a very talented defender, finishes well around the rim. But I think nonetheless, if the Knicks are going to lose Robinson in free agency, the mistake would be not doing a sign-in trade, because if you've been with a player for 4 years and you put a lot of time into him, you want to get something back if you're going to lose that player in free agency. Next, we've got one from Rads619, who wonders, who is a feasible free agent or player the Knicks could trade for this offseason? And, you know, feasible, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. But I think one player to keep an eye on, we've been talking about it since prior to the trade deadline, is Jalen Brunson, because Brunson is going to be an unrestricted free agent in Dallas. And I think that there's a number that Dallas is comfortable going to bring Brunson back. They want to bring him back, but they have to think long-term about tax implications. And I think that for another team to come in and go way above that number that Dallas is comfortable with, I think that team could go ahead and sign Jalen Brunson. So I think there's going to be several teams with interest in Brunson. I think the Knicks, he will continue to be on their radar into the offseason. It just depends on what Dallas does, what Brunson wants, and if the Knicks could potentially work out a sign and trade to make things work. We've got one from Logically Knicks, who asks, if the best player available on the draft is a power forward, would the Knicks consider drafting that player? Would they draft that player even if they had Obi Toppin and Julius Randle? My guess is no, and I say that for two reasons. One is, you look at that Obi Toppin draft, you know, teams after that draft were under the impression that Julius Randle was available via trade. So I have to think that, you know, part of the plan for the Knicks was maybe, hey, we're drafting Obi Toppin, and we'll look to trade Julius Randle. Now, Randle, obviously, if those were the plans, he ruined them because he came out and had an All-NBA season that next year. And so then you had Obi Toppin, your lottery pick, playing behind Julius Randle, who was playing, you know, 35 minutes a night, justifiably so. And that left the Knicks in a weird spot now with Toppin and Randle and how to proceed. So I can't see them drafting another power forward and putting themselves even more in that position of trying to figure out who gets minutes and how to move which player where. I would think that, you know, let's say they're drafting 8, 9, 10, there's enough varied talent available at that spot where they wouldn't have to pick the power forward. Even if that player was the best player available, they could address another position. We've got one from DJ Pure who asks, why does Tibbs keep alluding to the idea that Miles McBride, is not earning his minutes? Now, a couple of things on McBride and Thibodeau. Thibodeau, whenever he talks about McBride, he says he loves him. He loves his work ethic. He loves the progress that he's made, and he really believed in him as a player. I believe that Thibodeau was among the people in the organization pushing for the Knicks to draft McBride where they got him. I think they thought he was even going to go higher than that. So I think they're very happy with Miles McBride, Thibodeau included. The idea that he's not playing him, I chalk it up to maybe Thibodeau seeing McBride in practice and seeing him in other settings and determining that he's not ready to handle all those minutes. Now, we can agree or disagree on that thought, but I think that's part of the thinking here is Thibodeau seeing him in settings that, we on the outside are not seeing him, and clearly he's decided that he can't handle at this point that starting role. I asked Thibodeau earlier this week about if the Knicks were to fall further out of it, would you consider playing McBride ahead of Alec Burks? And he didn't commit to it. He said, listen, everybody earns their minutes. That's how we do it here. But he did not say that they would pivot to like a youth movement where McBride would play more. So we'll see how it goes from here on out to the end of the regular season. We've got one from Pascal Southside who wonders, what's the plan with Fournier, Noel, Burks, and Randle after the season? Well, I could tell you that on Fournier, Noel, and Burks, right, the Knicks were involved in some trade talks where those players' names would come up prior to the deadline. Obviously, nothing happened and they held on to them. But I would have to assume that at the very least, the Knicks would pick up the phone if teams were calling them on those players in the offseason. And if you look at their contracts, Burks becomes an expiring contract going into next season. And Evan Fournier is a contract that has 2 years on it going into next year. And then you look at Nerlens Noel, had an injury-plagued year this year. He's got an expiring deal going into next season. So those contracts become much more attractive trade pieces because of the idea that you're not committed to that player beyond that season if you're trading for him. And when you talk about Julius Randle, we know that there was teams that were interested in Randle prior to the deadline. They felt that he could really help them in different roles. And the Knicks obviously ultimately decided not to move Randle. I think because of that, it's more likely than not that he stays unless there's a deal that comes up where the team says, hey, we'll give you player X being like the face of a franchise type player, but you have to include Julius Randle in that deal. I think that's the one scenario where Randle would be moved for sure, but I don't see any other scenario where it's a slam dunk that the Knicks would trade him at this point. That's it for Begley's Mailbag, but please keep those questions coming. We'll be back with another Mailbag sometime early next month.